Ambassador Reth of the Vesh Confederation arrived at way station Tailais expecting theater. Every species performed the same ritual after defeat, contrition wrapped in diplomatic language, economic projections showing mutual benefit, apologies that never quite acknowledged wrongdoing. He'd negotiated 17 treaties across 4 wars. This would be number 18. The human waiting in the conference room shattered every assumption within seconds. She was small. Reth stood over 2 meters tall in his ceremonial exoskeleton. She barely reached his thorax. No military uniform, no intimidating entourage, just a simple gray suit and a briefcase that looked older than some of his junior officers. When she extended her hand, Reth grasped it awkwardly, mandibles clicking in what he hoped conveyed dignified respect. "Liaison Mira," she said. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. "I'm here to help us understand each other." Reth had brought 3 military advisors and a 12-page treaty draft. She had a briefcase and a patience that felt somehow threatening. "Ambassador Reth," Mira began after the pleasantries died their obligatory death, "I want to start by acknowledging the Confederation's losses. 17 colony ships, 43,000 military personnel, your orbital defense network around Vesh Prime. These are not trivial costs." Reth clicked agreement, settling into his practiced rhythm. "War spares no one. The Confederation recognizes that our initial assessment of Earth's strategic position was flawed." "Did you study us first?" The question landed like a blade between ribs, quiet, precise. Reth's advisors shifted. Junior tactician Vesh leaned forward. "Our survey data was comprehensive. 4th-generation scans, atmospheric composition, electromagnetic signatures suggesting pre-industrial." "When?" Mira asked. Vesh paused. "I'm sorry. When did you conduct the survey?" The Vesh exchanged glances. Something cold settled in Reth's gut. "Approximately 87 standard cycles ago." 87. Mira nodded slowly as if confirming something. She opened her briefcase and removed a slim datapad. "That would have been 2098 by our calendar. We just established permanent lunar habitats. Hadn't cracked faster-than-light travel yet. Still thought we were alone." She looked up. "That's what you saw, wasn't it? A divided planet, dozens of nation-states, conventional weapons, ripe for the taking." Reth said nothing. Nothing felt safer than anything. "Did it occur to anyone?" Mira continued. And there was something in her voice now, not anger, not accusation, just genuine curiosity. "To check if anything had changed in 87 years before you bombed Sydney." Vesh bristled. "Standard protocol requires verification of hostility indices." "You killed 4 million people in the opening salvo," Mira said. Her tone didn't change. "To establish dominance, did that require verification?" The room went very quiet. Reth cleared his throat. "The Confederation acknowledges that collateral damage." "I'm not here for an apology, Ambassador." That stopped him. In his entire career, no one had ever said that sentence. Mira closed the datapad. "I'm here because my superiors want to make sure this never happens again. Not to us, not to anyone." She looked at each of them in turn. "We're going to show you something. Call it a cultural exchange. You're going to visit Earth, not the military installations or the shipyards, somewhere else." "Liaison Mira," Reth said carefully. "The Confederation is prepared to discuss reparations, territorial adjustments." "We don't want your territory," she stood. "And we certainly don't want your technology. What we want is much simpler." She smiled, and Reth realized with a start that it didn't reach her eyes. "We want you to understand who you invaded." The landing site wasn't what Reth expected. No military parade grounds, no government complex projecting strength through architecture and armed guards. Instead, their shuttle touched down in a city that looked almost aggressively normal. Pedestrians walking dogs, electric trams humming past, children playing in a park visible from the landing pad. "Geneva," the pilot had called it, ancient by human standards, neutral territory even during their own wars. Mira met them at the pad wearing the same gray suit and unsettling calm. "Thank you for coming. The facility is a short walk." "Facility?" Reth asked. "Museum, technically. We built it 15 years ago after the unification. Follow me." They walked through clean streets lined with trees Reth couldn't name. Humans passed them with barely a glance, some curious, none hostile. A child waved. One of the younger Vesh advisors waved back uncertainly. "Your people seem unbothered by our presence," Vesh observed. "Why would they be bothered?" Mira asked. "You're here as guests. Besides, most of them have seen worse than surprised mantis people in their history feeds." The building appeared without fanfare. Modern architecture, glass and white stone. A simple plaque near the entrance read, "Archive of Collective Memory, established 2054. "Before we enter," Mira said, stopping at the doors, "I need to explain what you're about to see. This isn't a war museum. We have those elsewhere. This is something different." She met Reth's eyes. "This is where we keep the parts of our history we'd prefer to forget but refuse to." The doors opened. The first room was a timeline, but not the triumphant kind Reth had seen in other species monuments. This one was annotated with numbers that climbed steadily: 6 million, 20 million, 100 million, 500,000, 800,000. "The 20th century," Mira said, walking slowly past holographic displays, "was when we truly perfected industrial-scale atrocity. We'd always been violent, every species is, but we got efficient about it." One display showed skeletal figures behind wire fences. Another showed bodies in ditches, so many the Vesh couldn't count them. A third displayed medical instruments next to images that made Vesh turn away. "This section covers systematic genocides," Mira continued in that same even tone, as if discussing crop yields. "Ethnic, political, religious. We documented 12 major ones in a single century, and those are just the ones that reached international attention." "Why are you showing us this?" Reth asked quietly. "Context," Mira replied. She led them deeper into the archive. The next gallery was worse. Testimonies played on loop, survivors describing experiments, tortures, methods of killing designed for maximum efficiency or minimum cost. The Vesh had their own dark history, but they'd never cataloged it like this, never preserved it in such clinical detail. "Unit 731, Mira said, gesturing to one exhibit. "Medical experimentation on prisoners during our Second Global War. Vivisection without anesthesia. Deliberate infection with pathogens. Pressure chambers to see how much humans could withstand before organs ruptured." She paused. "The researchers were never prosecuted. We gave them immunity in exchange for their data." One of the younger Vesh made a sound of distress. Mira turned to him. "Are you all right?" Your own people did this to each other." "Extensively," Mira confirmed. "The colonial period was particularly inventive. Forced labor systems that killed millions, deliberate famines used as weapons, cultural erasure programs. We have a whole wing dedicated to that if you'd like to see it." "No," Reth said quickly. "No, I think we understand." "Do you?" Mira asked. And for the first time there was an edge in her voice. "Because here's what I need you to understand, Ambassador. Every species tells itself a story about its capacity for violence. You tell yourselves you're efficient conquerors. The Karathi claim they're honorable warriors." She gestured around the room. "We stopped telling ourselves stories. We just kept the receipts." She walked them through 3 more galleries. Slave markets, concentration camps, atomic shadows burned into concrete where people had been vaporized. Each exhibit was paired with documentation, orders, memos, bureaucratic paperwork that showed how ordinary individuals had organized extraordinary evil. "The Rwanda genocide happened in 100 days," Mira said in front of one display. Neighbors killed neighbors with farming tools. We killed 800,000 people in less time than your invasion lasted, and we did it with machetes and radio broadcasts. Why preserve this? The old warrior asked, his voice hollow. Why not move forward, forget? Because forgetting is how it happens again, Mira said simply. She led them to a final room. It was different from the others, cleaner, more sterile, less like a memorial and more like a military planning center. This, Mira announced, is our favorite part. The walls displayed scenarios, hundreds of them, each labeled with clinical precision. Response protocol, extinction threat. Contingency, orbital bombardment. Scenario 47, cultural erasure attempt. Reth approached one display slowly. It outlined a strategy for asymmetric warfare against a technologically superior occupying force. The level of detail was staggering. Supply chain disruption, psychological warfare, biological countermeasures, strategies for turning an enemy's infrastructure against them. These are theoretical, Vesh asked weakly. They were, Mira said, before you invaded. Then we pulled them out, updated them for your specific technology, and implemented them. She touched a screen and a new file appeared. These are the current versions. We've been refining them based on what we learned from your attack. You're threatening us, Reth said. No, Mira's voice was firm. We're showing you our work, there's a difference. She gestured to the archives behind them. Everything you've seen today, the genocides, the experiments, the systematic cruelties, those were things we did when we thought we were civilized. When we had ethics committees and international laws and people who said, never again, after every atrocity. She let that sink in. You invaded us with orbital weapons and occupation forces. You killed millions in your opening strike, and you did it assuming we'd roll over because your survey said we were divided and primitive. She smiled that empty smile again. The only reason your casualties weren't worse is because we used the old protocols, the ones we developed when we still cared about proportional response. The silence stretched. Finally, Reth found his voice. What do you want from us? Nothing, Mira said. This isn't a negotiation, it's a history lesson. She checked her watch. We have one more stop. The transport is waiting outside. As they filed out, Reth looked back at the archives. Decades of humanity's worst impulses preserved and studied with the same care another species might give to great art or scientific achievement. The old warrior spoke quietly beside him. They don't need to threaten us. They just need us to know what they already know about themselves. Outside, the sun was setting over Geneva. The city looked peaceful, beautiful even. Reth had never been more terrified in his life. The rehabilitation center sat on the outskirts of what had once been Melbourne. Reth could see the scars from orbit during their descent, a massive crater where the city center used to be, now filled with water and converted into a memorial lake. Around it, new construction blended with restored historical buildings, creating a patchwork geography of destruction and renewal. 5 million lived here before your first strike, Mira said as their transport descended. Population's back up to 3 million now, refugees from other hit zones mostly. Turns out people like living next to reminders. The center itself was low and sprawling, designed more like a university campus than a medical facility. Gardens, open courtyards, people walking freely, some with visible prosthetics, others with scars that told stories Reth didn't want to imagine. These are combatants, Vesh asked. Civilians, Mira corrected. The soldiers have their own facilities. These are the people who were just living their lives when you decided their planet looked easy. She led them to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the memorial lake. 23 humans waited inside, arranged in a rough semicircle. Ages varied wildly, children who'd grown into teenagers, elderly who'd survived on spite, everyone in between. Thank you all for agreeing to this, Mira said to the room, then to the Vesh. They volunteered. Nobody was compelled to be here. An elderly man with burned scars covering half his face spoke first. His voice was steady, measured. "I'm David Moore, retired mathematics professor. I was teaching a seminar when your kinetic strike hit the university district." He paused. "My wife was in the faculty lounge. My daughter was walking to her chemistry lab. My grandson was in daycare 3 blocks away." He let the past tense do its work. "I have a question for you, Ambassador. What was your plan for us after you won? What were you going to do with the survivors?" Reth felt every eye in the room on him. The Confederation's protocols for integration follow established galactic standards. Populations are assessed for skill compatibility, assigned to appropriate labor sectors. "Slavery," a young woman interrupted. She was maybe 20, with laser-burned scars running down her left arm in precise lines that suggested she'd been caught in sustained fire. "You're describing slavery with extra steps." "Resource optimization," Vesh said reflexively, then seemed to realize his mistake. "Right," the woman said. "I'm Priya Okonkwo. I was 16 when you invaded, hiding in a basement with 42 other people while your ground forces swept the neighborhood." She leaned forward. "Here's what I remember. Your soldiers had scanners. They were checking buildings systematically, not for combatants, for biological signatures. When they found us, they separated us by age and physical condition. The elderly and the injured were left behind. The rest of us were marked for transport." "Standard triage procedures," Vesh started. "We heard the explosions," Priya said flatly. "After they marched us out the buildings we'd left behind," she stopped. "You weren't triaging, you were culling." The silence that followed had weight. A middle-aged man with cybernetic replacements for both legs spoke next. "Marcus Webb, infrastructure engineer. I worked on Earth's early faster-than-light drives." He gestured at his prosthetics. "Lost these when your forces bombed the research facility. 37 of my colleagues died in that strike." He paused. "My question is simpler than David's. Did anyone in your chain of command ask what we'd become before you attacked? Not what we were 90 years ago, what we were the day you arrived." Reth had no answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse. "Because here's the thing," Webb continued. "We just cracked your encryption protocols. We were 3 months from reverse engineering your faster-than-light signature masking. Our artificial intelligence networks had modeled 17 different scenarios for first contact with hostile aliens." He smiled without humor. "You weren't a surprise. You were a test case we'd already run simulations on." A teenager raised his hand tentatively. Mira nodded at him. "I'm Jonas. I don't have a last name anymore. My whole family died and I never figured out who I should be after that." His voice cracked slightly. "I just want to know if it bothered you. Not the invasion, I get that wars happen. But did it bother any of you that you were killing kids? That some of us watched our parents burn? That we starved in occupation zones while your soldiers ate rations?" The younger Vesh advisor looked physically ill. "We didn't. Orders came from command. Individual soldiers don't question strategic." "I was 8, Jonas said quietly. 8 years old, hiding under bodies because your patrols didn't check corpses carefully. I stayed there for 6 hours until the resistance found me." He looked at his hands. "I still smell it sometimes. When it rains, when things get humid, I smell the people who died keeping me hidden." David Moore spoke again. "You're not here for absolution, Ambassador. We can't give you that, and I don't think you actually want it, but we need to understand the mechanism. How does a civilization decide to do this? What meetings happened? What votes were taken? Was there debate?" "The council convened," Reth began. "Did anyone vote against it?" Moore pressed. "Silence." "Did anyone ask what you'd do if you were wrong about us?" Priya added. More silence. "Did anyone," Webb said slowly, "calculate the risk of attacking a species you hadn't bothered to update your intelligence on?" a woman who'd been quiet until now finally spoke. She was perhaps 40, with a scholar's bearing despite the visible tremor in her hands. Dr. Rachel Kimani, Xenopsychology. I've been studying your cultural data since you arrived in our system. She stood, walked to the window. Do you know what fascinates me most about the Vesh Confederation? Your literature is full of cautionary tales about hubris. Your philosophy emphasizes measured response. Your art celebrates patience. She turned back. So what happened? How did a culture that values caution launch an invasion based on century-old data? That's not military aggression. That's bureaucratic negligence on a genocidal scale. Reth found his voice. We made mistakes, catastrophic ones. The Confederation acknowledges. We know you acknowledge it, Moore interrupted gently. We've read your apology drafts. 17 versions, each one carefully worded to avoid actual culpability. He leaned forward. But here's what you need to understand. We're not interviewing you for revenge. We're interviewing you for research. That word hung in the air like a live explosive. Mira stepped forward. Every person in this room is part of a project. We're building a predictive model for hostile first contact scenarios. What leads to invasion? What assumptions aggressors make? What blind spots they exploit? She gestured at the Vesh delegation. Your invasion is case study number 7, and the most useful one so far because you documented everything. Priya smiled, and it was worse than any expression of hate would have been. We're making sure we recognize you next time. Not your ships or your technology, those will change. But the thinking, the casual certainty that you can just take what you want because your scan said it would be easy. Webb nodded. We're learning to spot the pattern before the first shot gets fired. Jonas looked directly at the youngest Vesh advisor. And when we see it again, in anyone attacking anyone, we'll remember what it looks like from the inside, what you did to us, what it felt like. Moore stood, joints creaking. Thank you for your time, Ambassador. I think we have what we need. As the survivors filed out, each one made eye contact with at least one member of the Vesh delegation. Not hostile, not forgiving, just observing, recording, filing away data. When the room emptied, Reth realized he was shaking. They weren't angry, the old warrior whispered. I've seen anger that wasn't anger. No, Mira agreed. That was something much more dangerous. That was humans doing what we do best, learning from trauma. She gestured toward the door. The transport is ready. One final stop and then you can go home. Reth followed her out, past gardens where survivors practiced physical therapy, past memorial walls listing the dead, past children who'd grown up knowing exactly what alien invasion meant. And he understood finally what Mira had been trying to show them. Humans didn't just win their war. They'd turned their entire catastrophe into a curriculum. Back at Waystation Tailey's, Reth expected formality, documents, signatures, the ceremonial closure that civilized species performed after conflicts resolved themselves. Instead, Mira arrived carrying 3 data cores. These are for you, she said, placing them on the negotiation table with surprising gentleness. Complete tactical analysis of your invasion, every engagement, every strategic decision, every operational weakness we exploited. She tapped the first core. This one includes psychological profiles of your command structure. We interviewed prisoners extensively. They were very cooperative once they understood we weren't interested in punishment. Vesh stared at the cores like they might explode. You're giving us our own military intelligence. Corrected and annotated, Mira confirmed. Your officers misunderstood several of our countertactics. We've clarified those sections. She placed a 4th core on the table. This one's going to every government in the galactic network. Free distribution, universal access. The old warrior found his voice first. You're handing our strategic vulnerabilities to the entire galaxy. Along with ours, Mira said. She activated a holographic display. Files cascaded across the screen, thousands of them. Every war crime we committed during the counteroffensive, every civilian casualty we caused while liberating occupied zones, every interrogation where our people crossed lines they shouldn't have. She zoomed in on one file. This covers the incident in Jakarta. Our forces used prohibited chemical agents in a densely populated area to flush out your command post. Killed 300 of your soldiers and 48 human civilians who'd been forced into the building as shields. Reth couldn't process what he was seeing. This is operational security suicide. You're exposing yourselves. We're establishing precedent, Mira corrected, and we're removing excuses. Excuses, Vesh sounded bewildered. Mira sat down, folded her hands on the table. The next species that looks at Earth and sees an opportunity, and there will be one ambassador because the galaxy is apparently full of civilizations that don't update their survey data. They won't have the luxury of ignorance. They'll know exactly what we're capable of, what we did to you, what we did to ourselves in the process. She pulled up another file. They'll also know our weaknesses, our supply chain vulnerabilities, our political fracture points, the psychological tactics that worked against us. She smiled that terrible empty smile. We're making it a fair fight. Nothing about this is fair, the old warrior said hoarsely. You're guaranteeing future conflicts will be bloodier, more calculated. Opponents will know exactly where to strike you. Yes, Mira agreed. And we'll know they know, which means we adapt, we shore up weaknesses, we prepare. She leaned forward. But here's the critical part. They can't claim they didn't understand the cost. They can't pretend they thought we'd be easy. They can't launch an invasion based on outdated assumptions and act surprised when it goes sideways. Reth finally understood. You're weaponizing transparency. We're weaponizing accountability, Mira said. There's a difference. She stood, walked to the viewport overlooking the station's docking bay. 3 days ago, the Karathi Ascendancy contacted us. They'd been planning a diplomatic intervention in the Outer Rim, small species, recently discovered, lots of rare minerals on their homeworld. Standard colonial playbook. She glanced back. Then they accessed our files, read about what happened to you, ran the numbers on what it would cost them if they were wrong about this new species being helpless. And Vesh asked. They've opened formal trade negotiations instead, equal partnership terms, technology exchange, mutual defense pact. Mira returned to the table, not because they suddenly grew a conscience, because we made the math visible. They can see the price now. She placed one hand on the data cores. We're not interested in reparations, Ambassador. Your economy is already devastated. Bleeding you dry accomplishes nothing. We don't want territory. We've got enough problems managing our own expansion without absorbing your colonies. She met Reth's eyes. What we want is for this to matter, for your mistake to mean something beyond our dead and yours. The youngest Vesh advisor, who'd been silent since the rehabilitation center, spoke up suddenly. You want us to be an example? No, Mira said. You already are an example. What we want is for the lesson to be complete. She gestured at the data cores. Take these home. Share them with your universities, your militaries, your cultural historians. Let your children study what you did and why it failed. Let them see both sides, your strategic assumptions and our response. Let them understand that warfare isn't just about ships and weapons. It's about knowing who you're fighting. Reth felt something break loose inside him. Anger maybe, or humiliation, or just exhaustion. Why not just conquer us? You won. You could occupy the Confederation, dismantle our government, impose whatever terms you wanted. Instead, you're giving us what? Educational materials. We're giving you context, Mira said quietly. The same context we gave ourselves when we built that archive in Geneva. The same context those survivors in Melbourne are using to build their predictive models. She paused. You know what we learned from cataloging our own atrocities, Ambassador, that the mechanisms are always the same. Dehumanization, or in this case, de-alienization, bureaucratic distance, certainty about moral superiority, failure to update information because the old information justified what you wanted to do anyway. She tapped the data cores again. These files show you making every single one of those mistakes in real time, with documentation. Vesh made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You're not just showing the galaxy our failures. You're teaching them to recognize the thinking that leads to invasion. Now you're getting it, Mira said. The old warrior stood slowly. This is cruelty, not physical worse. You're making it impossible for us to forget, for anyone to forget. This will define the Confederation for generations. Yes, Mira acknowledged. It will, the same way our wars define us, the same way every species' worst moments should define them if they're honest. She began gathering her materials. But here's the thing, Ambassador. We're not singling you out. We did the same thing to ourselves first. Everything we're making public about you, we've already made public about us. Every failure, every atrocity, every moment where we chose violence over wisdom. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Oh, I almost forgot the treaty. She placed a slim document on the table, 3 pages. Reth scanned it quickly, then read it again, certain he'd misunderstood. No reparations, no territorial concessions, no trade restrictions. Just one clause repeated 3 times in slightly different legal language. The Vesh Confederation agrees to full participation in the Galactic Archive of Conflict Documentation and will submit complete records of this engagement within 1 standard year. That's it, Reth asked. That's the price. That's the price, Mira confirmed. Your honesty, your documentation, your willingness to let this war be studied by everyone everywhere forever. She opened the door. The data cores include instructions for accessing the archive network. Upload your files there, military planning, civilian casualty reports, the intelligence that led you to think Earth was vulnerable. All of it. She paused in the doorway. And Ambassador, don't sanitize it, we'll know. We've become very good at spotting omissions. Then she was gone. The Vesh delegation sat in silence, staring at the treaty and the data cores. Finally, Reth picked up the signing stylus. His hand shook slightly as he applied his biometric seal to the document. We should celebrate, Vesh said hollowly. We invaded a human world and got away with this. No, the old warrior said, his voice distant. We invaded a human world and they got exactly what they wanted. He looked at the data cores. They didn't just beat us. They turned our entire war into a teaching moment for the rest of the galaxy. The youngest advisor was crying quietly. Everyone will know. Every species that looks at humans now will see us first. Will see what happens when you attack them without understanding them. Reth stood carefully, gathering the data cores. They were surprisingly light for objects that would define his civilization's legacy for centuries. Outside the viewport, a human transport vessel prepared for departure. On its hull, Reth could just make out the fresh paint, Cultural Exchange Initiative. Educational Missions 7 of 23. 23 missions. 23 delegations being shown the same museums, the same survivors, the same impossible choice between ignorance and complicity. She never threatened us, Reth said softly. Not once. In 3 days, she never raised her voice or implied violence or demanded anything we couldn't give. No, the old warrior agreed. She just made certain we'd never forget what we did, and made certain the galaxy wouldn't either. He looked at Reth. Do you understand now why they call it mercy? Reth thought about the archives, the survivors, the data cores full of painful truth. Because they could have killed us all, he said finally, but instead they made us live with what we learned. The warrior nodded. Mercy isn't always kind, Ambassador. Sometimes it just means you survive long enough to understand what you've done. They departed Way Station Tailey's 6 hours later, carrying humanity's gift, complete, unvarnished documentation of failure distributed freely to anyone interested in understanding how civilizations stumble into atrocity. The journey home took 3 weeks. Reth spent most of it reviewing the data cores, watching his own people's decisions play out with humanity's annotations alongside, every strategic assumption labeled, every intelligence failure highlighted, every moment where someone could have asked, "Are we sure?" marked in quiet, devastating detail. The Confederation's High Council met him at the orbital platform above Vesh Prime. They were expecting triumph, some version of victory snatched from defeat, territorial concessions minimized, economic impact contained. Instead, Reth handed them the data cores and the 3-page treaty. "This is all they demanded." Council Speaker Thren examined the document with disbelief. "Transparency, documentation." "That's all," Reth confirmed. "Then we got off remarkably easy for an unsuccessful invasion." "No," the old warrior said. He'd insisted on attending the debriefing despite retirement protocols. "We got exactly what we deserved." He activated a holographic display from the first data core. Files cascaded across the council chamber, tactical analyses, survivor testimonies, humanity's own war crimes laid bare alongside the Confederation's failures. "They didn't just defeat us," the warrior continued. "They made sure we'd understand why, and they made sure everyone else would too." 3 months later, the first Vesh University began teaching a mandatory course on the invasion. Professor Kess, who'd lost family in the human counteroffensive, stood before 200 students and opened with humanity's archive footage, not the battles but the museums. "This," she said, gesturing to images of human atrocities preserved in clinical detail, "is what they showed our delegation before negotiations began. They didn't threaten us with their weapons. They threatened us with their honesty." 5 years later, Earth protocols became standard terminology across the galaxy for pre-conflict intelligence verification. No government wanted to be the next case study in humanity's expanding educational archive. 10 years later, a joint Vesh human research station opened above Melbourne's Memorial Lake. Scientists from both species worked side by side, developing early warning systems for civilizations showing pre-invasion decision patterns. 20 years later, a young Vesh scholar named Ren, granddaughter of Ambassador Reth, published her thesis, "The Mathematics of Mercy: How Humanity's Transparency Doctrine Reduced Aggressive First Contact by 47%. She presented her findings at the Galactic Academy on Earth, in a conference hall overlooking the Geneva archive. Mira sat in the front row, older now, but with that same calm presence that had terrified an entire delegation decades earlier. "The conclusion is unavoidable," Ren said, her voice steady despite speaking to a room full of species who'd all accessed her grandfather's failure in educational archives across known space. "Humanity didn't just win a war. They changed the fundamental calculus of interstellar conflict." She pulled up comparative data, invasion attempts before and after humanity's files went public. The decline was stark, undeniable. They made aggression expensive in a new way, not through military deterrence, everyone expects that, but through social deterrence, through the certainty that your mistakes would become eternal teaching moments, that your civilization would be defined by its worst decisions, studied by every species capable of reading a data file. She paused, looking directly at Mira. "My grandfather died 5 years ago. His last words were about Melbourne, about a teenager named Jonas who'd hidden under bodies for 6 hours. He said he finally understood what mercy meant." After the presentation, Mira approached Ren in the courtyard outside. "Your grandfather was a good man who made a terrible mistake," Mira said. "I'm glad he found some peace at the end." Did you, Ren asked, find peace? Mira looked out over Geneva, where families walked through streets that had seen their own share of violent centuries before humanity reached the stars. No, she said quietly, but I found something better: purpose. She turned back to Ren. Your thesis is excellent. Have you considered joining the archive documentation project? We're always looking for researchers who understand both sides of conflict. I'd be honored, Ren said. Though I have to ask, is it true you have 23 educational missions running? 31 now, Mira corrected. We've expanded the program. Every species that shows pre-invasion indicators gets an invitation. Most decline initially. She smiled that slight, careful smile. But they all access the files. They all run the numbers. And so far, they all decide that whatever they thought they'd gain isn't worth becoming our next case study. That's not peace, Ren observed. No, Mira agreed. It's something more sustainable. It's accountability with teeth. It's the understanding that the galaxy is watching and will remember. She started walking toward the archive entrance. Come on. If you're joining the project, you should see the latest additions. We just got full documentation from the Plenar Dominion's colonial period. Turns out they've been hiding some spectacularly ugly history. And they just volunteered this information. Once they saw what we did with ours, and what it cost your grandfather's generation to hide theirs, they decided transparency was the cheaper option. Ren followed her inside, past exhibits that detailed humanity's capacity for both atrocity and reflection, past the tactical planning rooms where defensive scenarios were refined daily, past the gallery of survivors whose testimonies had helped reshape galactic diplomacy. In the Central Archive, new exhibits were being installed. The Plenar documentation, the Karatha's revised history acknowledging previously denied massacres, even the Catherine Collective, whose warrior culture had never admitted defeat, had contributed files on their tactical education from human defensive operations. This is incredible, Ren breathed. This is necessary, Mira corrected. Every species here made the same choice: keep pretending they were civilized conquerors, or admit they were capable of the same calculated cruelty that humans had cataloged in themselves. She touched a control panel, and a new section illuminated, still under construction but already impressive in scope. We're building a predictive wing, using all this data, yours, ours, everyone's, to develop algorithms that can identify pre-conflict patterns in diplomatic communications, economic indicators, military buildups. Not to prevent war entirely. That's impossible. Then what's the goal? To make sure everyone knows the cost before the first shot, to make the decision visible, to remove the comfort of willful ignorance. Mira looked back at the archive stretching in every direction, each one a civilization's worst moments preserved not as shame but as data, as warning, as shared responsibility. Your grandfather asked me once what we wanted from the Confederation. I told him we wanted you to understand who you'd invaded. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. What I didn't tell him was that we wanted you to help us make sure it mattered, that your mistake, our response, all of it, would mean something beyond the dead. Ren looked around the archive, understanding finally crystallizing. You didn't just defeat us, you recruited us. We recruited everyone, Mira confirmed. Because the alternative, letting civilizations stumble into atrocity through ignorance or arrogance or outdated intelligence, that's not just immoral, it's inefficient. She gestured at the data flowing across screens. The visitors from a dozen species studying humanity's organized evil alongside their own. The researchers collaborating on models that might save millions by making the cost of violence visible before it started. This is what humans do, Ren. We survive catastrophe, we catalog it, and then we make absolutely certain nobody else can claim they didn't know better. Outside, the sun set over Geneva. In the memorial lake above Melbourne, lights flickered on, one for each of the 5 million who died in the opening strike that started a war and ended an era of comfortable aggression. And across the galaxy, in government chambers and military academies and university lecture halls, species that had once measured conquest in terms of resources and territory now measured it in a new, more honest currency. The certainty that their failures would outlive them. The knowledge that humans would make sure of it. The understanding that mercy, in humanity's hands, was no longer a word that meant forgiveness. It meant memory. And memory, it turned out, was the most powerful weapon of all.